One night when I was 5 years old, my grandmother and I were alone on the farm. I don't remember where everyone else was. I only remember the storm. The KwaZulu-Natal Midlands produces storms unlike anything I have met before or since. It doesn't simply rain there. The storms arrive. The thunder rolls out over the hills for hours and hours, and the whole house shakes. The sky itself tears open. And I was certain that the farmhouse was going to be washed off the hill. So, in the darkest part of the night, I climbed into my grandmother's bed and whispered to her, "Noni, the house is going to be washed away." And she pulled me close and she whispered back, "Shh, alley cat, listen. Isn't it wonderful?" And she said it with such awe, such delight, as though she couldn't believe we were lucky enough to be witnessing something so magnificent. Nothing about that storm changed that night, only my way of seeing it. And that way of seeing has never changed back. To this day, when thunder rolls out across the hills, some part of me still hears her awe and her reverence for nature itself. That was my grandmother, and this video is hers. If you're new here, I'm Zila Farako, a witch with a PhD in medical microbiology, and this channel lives where witchcraft, science, and survival meet. Last week, I told you the story of growing up inside of my grandfather's world, in a family unit that became a cult. At the end of it, I made you a promise that my grandmother, the one soft place in that entire world, had an inheritance of her own, and that her story deserved its own videos. And the comments made it very clear that you wanted to know more, so here it is. Now, before I tell you her story, I want to tell you the truth, because this isn't really a video about my grandmother, it's about yours. Because I have a suspicion that somewhere in your family there was someone like her, a woman with the traditional healing remedies, the strange sayings, the little rituals that everyone called tradition or superstition, the one who spoke to her plants, who always knew when rain was coming, or quietly did odd little things with bread, salt, thread, or herbs without ever explaining why. By the end of this video, I hope that you'll never look at those women in quite the same way again. In fact, I hope you reach the end of this video with someone in mind that you want to phone, and a whole new set of questions to ask before that knowledge disappears forever. Telling my grandmother's story feels like wet earth after the rain, like wind singing across the rock, like doves purring in the oak trees and a cat asleep by the hearth. It feels like coming home. And if you watched my video on what it was like growing up inside of a cult, you'll remember her from that video as the woman who had to give away every beautiful thing she'd ever collected because her husband decided that beauty was idol worship. What I didn't tell you then was that there was something he was never able to confiscate, something he couldn't because he never once recognized it for what it was. It lived in her hands, in her garden, and in the words she taught me to say, and this is the story of that. And I want to say upfront what this video is and isn't. I'm not going to tell you that my grandmother secretly identified as a witch or lit candles to the old gods. She didn't. And she never said that word witch. She was, by her own understanding, a devout Christian woman her entire life. But whether she knew what she was carrying turns out to be a much more complicated question than I believed when I sat down to write this. And I'll show you exactly why. And by the end, you can decide for yourself what to call her. That is how we do things here. To understand understand my grandmother, we have to start long before my grandfather came into the picture, in the Drakensberg Mountains. She grew up running wild in those mountains. Her father was the man who built Tendele Camp in the Royal Natal National Park with his own hands. And before he could build the camp, he actually had to build the road to reach it. So she was raised as a daughter of the Drakensberg, learning the plants and the animals of those slopes the way other children learned streets. And two rivers of knowing met in her. From her mother came the older one, a language of plants handed down woman to woman that looked remarkably like what the English tradition calls Wortcunning. And I'll come back to that word because it matters. Whether the women of my family would ever have used it is a different question entirely. They certainly would never have called themselves witches. But they carried a way of knowing plants that had passed down from mother to daughter for generations. And from her father came the second river. That was natural history, observation, and documentation, the Latin names for things. He walked those mountains recording what grew there, and he taught his daughter to see and name and understand all she saw in those ancient wild mountains. And so she inherited both. She could tell you what a plant was called in Latin, and she could tell you what to do with it when a child had a cough. One river was science and one was relationship. She never seemed to notice that there were supposed to be different rivers. And I can hold part of that inheritance in my own hands. That lineage was written into a book, and this year I finally was able to track down a copy through a rare book dealer. A book I had heard about my whole life but had never actually touched, written and signed by my great-grandfather's own hand. I wanted to hold it for the same reason this whole series exists. This is a piece of my lineage reclaimed. While preparing this book, where he meticulously photographed and catalogued all of the species that he found within the Natal Drakensberg Mountains, he even catalogued some previously undiscovered plants, including this one, Sandersonia aurantiaca. He named this one after my great-grandmother, whose maiden surname was Sanderson. This particular plant is also known as Christmas bells because it flowers in December and January, and its Zulu name is Ihlamvu. The plant Selago trouseldii was actually named after him. Now, my grandmother was sent to a convent school, strict and hard and cruel at times, but she knew kindness and love at home and pure freedom in the heart of the African mountains. And that's the woman who eventually arrived in my grandfather's world, a wild woman at heart, carrying those two rivers of knowing that no one around could fully see. So let me explain what I actually saw growing up beside her. First of all, there was always a garden containing many gardens, a herb garden, a vegetable garden, a flower garden, and every single windowsill was crowded with cuttings and seedlings and jars. The kitchen and the garden were her real church, and looking back, almost everything she gave me was given there. When I was 9 years old, she marked out a small patch of earth that was to be mine to tend, and together we planted rosemary and thyme and sage and mint and parsley and many herbs that always seemed to belong wherever she was, along with tree tomatoes and indigenous aloes, impepo, and African sage. And she taught me to make compost from the guavas that fell from our trees every summer. We had more guavas than we knew what to do with. And she taught me that nothing truly dies in a garden. Everything becomes food for something else. She taught me as well to treasure worms, because yes, they were useful, but most of all, they were sacred. Whenever we uncovered one whilst digging, we would lift it gently out of the sun, thank it for its work, and return it safely to the soil. And she never spoke about dominion over nature. She always spoke about having gratitude and feeling interconnection with nature. One day when I was very young, I went around the farm with a bucket and I collected every shongololo I could find. And I found around 30 of these massive, glossy African millipedes. And I carried my bucket proudly into her kitchen. Any other adult in that house would have beaten and scolded me straight back out the door, but my grandmother knelt down beside me, and together we cut up potatoes and placed them in the bucket together. And for the next week, we watched those millipedes slowly tunnel their way through the potatoes until eventually it was time to carry them back outside and release them where I'd found them. She turned what would have been a scolding into an invitation to wonder, and she did that constantly with me. Animals were part of the family. Every day we walked through the vegetable garden to visit the chickens and the geese, and collecting the eggs was never just collecting food. We thanked them, we spoke to them, we offered small prayers of gratitude, because gratitude was simply how you lived near her. She spoke to animals in their own sounds, not in any human language. I was nursing a baby bird as a child, and it lived in the kitchen, and my grandmother would sing to it in birdsong, and it would listen, and it loved her. All the dogs loved her, all the cats loved her. Our Siamese cat Toulouse followed her everywhere, crying loudly each morning for fresh milk straight from the cow. Whenever I found an injured animal on that land, and it was a lot of wild empty land, I carried it straight to her, and together we fed orphaned baby birds from our hands, and we tried to save whatever could be saved. Another thing I grew up taking completely for granted was dowsing. When my grandparents needed to decide where to dig for water on Oakley Farm, my grandmother walked the land carrying a forked branch that had been cut from a willow tree, and I remember watching it dip and pull in her hands as she searched for the underground water, and that's where we sank the borehole. Nobody around me questioned it. It was simply understood that this was one of the gifts that God had given her. And looking back, I find that fascinating. In my grandfather's world, almost every spiritual gift was viewed with suspicion unless it came through him. Yet somehow my grandmother's dowsing escaped that suspicion. It was accepted because it was useful, and because it found water, and because she explained it as well as one of God's gifts rather than anything mystical. But dowsing wasn't unusual in my grandmother's world. It belonged to a much larger way of seeing reality. She never believed the world was made only of matter. She believed objects could carry intention. Little pieces of jewelry she wore weren't simply decorative, they all meant something. They protected something. Symbolism itself had power, and she paid attention to omens, to unlikely coincidences, and to the behavior of birds and animals, to the way the world seemed to answer back if you just learned how to listen. And if she suddenly thought of someone she hadn't seen in years, she'd quietly say, "They're gonna phone today." And more often than not, they did. Before answering the telephone, she often already knew who was calling. And none of this was dramatic. None of it was presented as supernatural. It was simply another way the world communicated. To my grandmother, intuition or psychic abilities wasn't extraordinary. It was just part of being fully alive and paying attention. And plants were the very center of who she was. She didn't just tend to plants or speak to plants. In her beautiful singing voice, she sang to them while she gardened. She believed they responded to care and to voice and intention. And as a child, I never questioned it because it was simply how plants were treated. And then there were the words, because this is where I have to complicate what I said at the start. She taught me the words to say to plants, and she taught me the words to say to insects. And looking back now, I know them for what they are. They were spells and incantations, every one of them, but she would never have called them that. To her, they were simply little sayings or nursery rhymes or bits of folklore, things you simply did that meant nobody could ever confuse them with heresy. She taught me how to bundle herbs together into charms, and she taught me how to call rain and how to banish a storm and how to sing into the wind so that the song would bless the earth and carry my intention out into the world. She taught me to tell the bees everything, the old way, and when I was 9, I had grown far too bold with the bees, thinking them my friends, and so I stuck my hand straight into the beehive in the tree trunk, and a single bee flew out into my face and stung my lip. My whole face swelled up. My grandmother laughed at the state of me, and then she told me 2 things in one breath: that the bees had spoken their boundaries and I was to take them seriously, and that I was developing a dangerous allergy and might not be so lucky next time. That was her in a single sentence. The folk knowing and the clinical eye, the reverence and the medicine, and never once at war with each other. When I had nightmares, she didn't only soothe them, she taught me to bundle lavender, rosemary, and lemon balm tied with a white ribbon to be placed under my pillow. And she taught me as well how to dream lucidly, how to wake up inside of the dream and walk around it. I was a child, and I assumed every grandmother did this. And then there is the notebook. When I left for Cape Town at age 17, my grandmother handed me a little book, and inside, written out in her curling cursive hand, were pages of what she simply called words of wisdom. Rhymes, sayings, blessings, plant lore, little pieces of her world given to me to carry. She never called it a grimoire. She would have been startled by the word. It was a handwritten book of spells and sayings passed from a grandmother to a granddaughter at the threshold of her leaving. Words of wisdom. A rhyme surfaces while I'm gardening, or saying arrives whole when I crush a leaf between my fingers. Now, the charm she mentioned earlier to banish nightmares was in that book, the one with the herbal bundle, and that went like this. When I lay my head to sleep, 4 bright angels watch and keep, one at the door, one at the hearth, one at my head and one at my heart. Let no shadow cross this bed, no fearful dream or wandering dread. By heaven's light and morning's grace, leave only peace within this place. Spiders were also very welcome in our home, but sometimes they needed to be relocated because maybe they were in a location that was dangerous to them, or maybe it was the venomous variety. So when I needed to relocate a spider, I was to say, "Little spider, quiet friend, spinner of the silver thread, may your weaving prosper well, but not within the place I dwell. Go in peace to beam or tree, leave this hearth in harmony. May we each our dwelling keep, and both find shelter, both find sleep." One thing I did not inherit from my grandmother was any living tradition surrounding the fae or the fairies. That's something people often assume when they hear words like folk tradition or witchcraft, but it simply wasn't part of our family lineage. My grandmother adored tales of fairies, and she made sure my little sister grew up with Cicely Mary Barker's Flower Fairies books and delicate, beautiful little fairy figurines, but those belonged to the world of story and not to our living practice. If my ancestors had once carried tales of the good people or the fae from Britain, they hadn't survived the long journey through many generations in India and then South Africa. And by the time they reached my grandmother, those stories appear to have been completely lost. Instead, I inherited the stories of the land we actually lived upon. So I grew up with the lore of the Natal Midlands. Ikanyamba, the great serpent dwelling beneath Howick Falls, the Tokolosh, sacred rivers, omens carried by snakes and lizards, and the trickster animals that weave through Zulu fireside tales. The old relationship with the more than human world survived, but the beings themselves changed. because they were shaped by the new landscape and the new natural neighbors. And that's probably a whole video in itself, because those stories deserve to be explored on their own terms rather than folded into a video about European folk tradition. If that's something you'd like to hear about, my South African folklore and tales, let me know in the comments below. Underneath everything my grandmother gave me was a way of seeing the natural world that I only found language for decades later. She never studied energy healing. She never read a New Age book in her life. Yet, when I met those ideas as an adult, they felt strangely familiar because she had always spoken about the body as though everything in it was connected, as though herbs didn't attack symptoms so much as they worked with the body's own intelligence. And when I brought home the things school was teaching me, biology and chemistry and the beginnings of the scientist I'd become, she never once flinched. She would always say science was slowly expanding spirituality. Not that science was wrong, never that. Rather that science would one day reveal the truths we already know, which is that everything is conscious and we are one with nature. I didn't realize it then, but she was giving me permission to become both a scientist and a witch long before I believed either was possible. Notice what every one of those memories has in common. At no point did my grandmother ever sit me down and say, "Today I'm going to teach you magic." There was no category called magic and not magic. There was simply a way of living in relationship with the world. These were just the things that you did. In England, the old herb craft had a name, Wortcunning, and I promise to come back to that word. Wort or wort is the Old English word for plant, the one still hiding inside mugwort and St. John's wort. And cunning or cunnin comes from the Old English for knowing. Wort cunning, plant knowing, the craft of garden and hedgerow, of witch leaf for witch fever, kept mostly by women, passed mostly by hand, mother to daughter, grandmother to grandchild. Now, when Christianity spread across Europe, it didn't exactly destroy the older ways. Mostly something stranger happened. Absorption. Healing charms kept their rhymes and swapped the old names for the Trinity. Sacred wells kept their pilgrims and were renamed for saints. Protective marks went on being scratched into hearths and thresholds. Herbs went on being gathered on the old significant days. The cunning folk of England, the village healers and charmers, worked openly for centuries, using psalms and prayers as their working words, and most of them would have been genuinely offended to be called anything but good Christians. Over enough generations, the practice and the prayer fused so completely that there was no seam left to find between them. But there was a second way the old knowing survived, and my grandmother's thread is mostly this one. Some of it never needed a disguise at all because it lived below the level of doctrine entirely. No church council ever ruled on thanking worms. No catechism forbids singing to a baby bird in its own language. The kitchen, the garden, and the nursery and the sickbed, these were considered too small, too female, too domestic to police. And so the oldest way of relating to the living world simply carried on there, unnamed and therefore unkilled, in the hands of women whose domain nobody thought to conquer. People stopped calling any of it witchcraft, or maybe they never called it that in the first place. That doesn't mean it disappeared. It means it went where no one was looking. Which brings me back to that household, because here's the thing I only understood years later. My grandparents didn't just have different temperaments, they inhabited two completely different universes under one roof. My grandfather's universe was hierarchy. You'll remember it from the last video. God above man, man above woman, woman above child, and humanity above the whole of creation. Animals and the environment just existed to serve. Land existed to be used. Worth was measured in obedience, and everything below you on the ladder was yours to command. Now, my grandmother's universe had no ladder in it at all. Worms mattered. Millipedes mattered. Chickens were thanked. Compost was a place where life continued rather than ended. She never spoke about dominion. She spoke about belonging and about a world where we were not standing above nature but standing inside of it. One small part among all of the rest of creation. Everything participated, everything had a place, everything deserved care. And both of these universes were being taught to the same child in the same house at the same time. His from the pulpit of the lounge, and hers from the vegetable garden without a single sermon. And if you want the two universes in a single image, take the weather. My grandfather looked at a storm and saw prophecy, the end of the world rolling out across the hills. I told you last time that dread was simply what existence felt like in the rooms that he ruled. My grandmother looked at the same storm and saw extraordinary beauty. The same child who learned in the lounge to dread the end of the world, learned in the night to crave storms that shook the earth. I do remember how she changed when he entered the room. The jewelry she wore with intention, the little objects she created as protective became merely pretty things, decoration and nothing more. The plants she spoke of as living presences became herbs for cooking or remedies for a cough and nothing more. The language of energy narrowed to the language of health or medicine or cooking. Everything remained exactly where it had been, but its meaning folded itself away. And she never announced that she was hiding anything, and perhaps she would never have understood it in those terms. But I watched her make herself smaller around him. Her voice softened, her delight became careful, and yet every now and then I would catch a glimpse of the girl who had once run wild through the Drakensberg. In the way she greeted an old tree like a friend, in the reverence with which she cradled an injured bird, in the joy with which she sang to the plants as she worked the garden. Those moments became rarer as the years went by. The spark in her eyes grew dimmer until by the end of her life it seemed to have gone out altogether. But before it did, she had already placed something living into my hands. She taught me how to see the world as alive, as worthy of reverence, as something we belong to rather than stand above. And perhaps that is why even now telling her story feels like finding my way home. I cannot tell you what she believed. She never said, and I won't put words in a mouth that can no longer answer, but I can tell you this much. She knew enough to disguise what she taught me. Incantations arrived as nursery rhymes. A book of spells arrived titled Words of Wisdom. Whether she dressed them herself or she received them already disguised that way, generations deep, I will never know. Either way, the presentation tells the same story. This is knowledge that learned how to survive, and she practiced it in plain sight, in the kitchen and the garden, and in the fussing over small children and animals, ground he considered beneath him. It turned out to be the only unconquered ground in that entire house, and everything she gave me there. I don't know whether my grandmother would ever have recognized the words I use today. Folk magic, witchcraft, animism, or even Wortcunning. I suspect she would have smiled, handed me a basket, and sent me out to gather herbs before the rain came. To her, This was never an identity. It was simply the way you moved through the world, and perhaps that is why it survived at all. So, was my grandmother a witch? She would have said no. She would probably have been horrified by the question. And I want to take that horror seriously rather than just brush it aside, because her whole world had taught her that the word witch meant evil, meant everything that she stood against. In the last video, I told you my mother couldn't say the word cult about her own life, and that I couldn't either for 30 years, because nobody hands you the language for the water you're swimming in. My grandmother is the third woman in this family who lived something enormous without a word for it. And here's the difference. Cult was a word my mother needed for the gift of understanding her life on her deathbed. Witch is a word I offer my grandmother as an inheritance, as ancestral healing, and I hold it out to her the way she handed things to me, gently, without force, as something she can refuse. By every definition her church would have used, she was an extremely devout Christian woman, the very picture of piety. What I finally understand about her is that she was never interested in religion per se. She was deeply, deeply spiritual. She craved and nurtured relationship with plants, with animals, with the land, with her God, and with the people she loved. And she didn't hand me beliefs. She handed me that relationship itself. One worm and one shongololo and one thanked chicken at a time. This is why the innermost circle of my Patreon carries the only name I have for her craft. The Wortcunners are named thusly for her. And there's one more thing I only realized recently. My grandmother inherited her mother's practical wisdom of plants and her father's scientific botany. She never believed those things were different kinds of knowledge. Somewhere along the way, the modern world has insisted we must choose between wonder and understanding, between science and spirituality. Every video on this channel begins the same way. Hi, I'm Zila and I'm a witch with the PhD. I used to think I had spent my life building a bridge between those two worlds, but I hadn't. My grandmother had already crossed it, and I was simply walking in her steps. Somewhere in your family, there is almost certainly a woman like her. The one with the sayings, the one with the remedies, the one who did things with bread or salt or red thread, or the garden and called it tradition or superstition or nothing at all. She wasn't unusual. Across much of the world, the old ways rarely disappeared overnight. They were renamed and absorbed and hidden or dismissed or quietly folded into whatever belief system survived. Some lineages experience this through Christianization, others through colonialism, many through both. The details are different, but the pattern is hauntingly familiar. People forget the language of their inheritance long before they stop carrying it. People often ask me, what actually survived all that forgetting? Now, I used to think the honest answer was fragments, but I don't believe that anymore. Relationships survived. It survived in the hands of people like my grandmother, people who behaved without ever arguing the point, as though the world was listening, because in her world it was. The bees, the plants, the wind, the storms, none of them were inert. All of them were participants in her life. And that story, why so many of us feel spiritually homeless, what colonization and empire does to these memories, these ways of living, why inherited traditions so often survive under different names and wearing disguises, and what all of this has to do with yoga studios, cultural appropriation, and the strange ache you might be feeling right now. This is where we're going to go in future videos. For now, I want to invite you to do something. Go and ask your parents, your grandparents, your aunties, your uncles. Ask about the sayings before the people who carry them are gone. Ask about the remedies, the little rituals, the strange superstitions, the things that were simply the way we do it. Because this knowledge doesn't disappear all at once. It disappears one funeral at a time. And then come back here and tell us your stories in the comments. Tell us about the bread your grandmother baked, the herbs she hung by the door, the rhyme she whispered over scraped knees, the strange thing she always did with salt or thread or rainwater or bees. I read every single comment, and I have a feeling that together we could build one of the richest living archives of surviving family folk traditions anywhere on the internet. Because maybe the story we've inherited isn't that the old ways have died. Maybe it's simply that nobody thought to ask their grandmothers. She never called herself a witch. She just made absolutely certain that I would become one. And when the storms rumble in across the rolling hills, I still hear her. Shh. Listen, isn't it wonderful? If this story found something in you, I'd love it if you subscribed and joined me here. Every week, we're piecing together the forgotten threads of folklore, witchcraft, history, and the living traditions that survived where no one thought to look. And if you'd like to shape the direction of the series, the Wortcunning tier of the Wyrd Circle on Patreon, vote on topics I explore next, and the link is below. Until next time, don't forget to ask your grandmother.